Imagine the year is 701 BCE. The world is a terrifying place, especially if you're, living in the Levant.
Hmm.
The Assyrian war machine, which is probably the most brutal, efficient military force the ancient world has ever seen, is on the move. They are just sweeping down the coast, crushing everything in their path.
Total
The
devastation.
northern kingdom of Israel, it's gone, wiped off the map just, 20 years before this?
About that, yeah, 722 BCE. So this is still a fresh wound in the region's memory.
And now, the Assyrian king, Sennacherib, has turned his gaze south to Jerusalem, to a king named Hezekiah.
And this is a moment of absolute existential crisis. I think we often read these stories in a vacuum, but you have to understand the geopolitical reality here. This isn't just a border skirmish.
No.
This is the superpower of the day. I mean, think the Roman Empire at its height, or, a modern superpower knocking on the door of a tiny hill country kingdom. And they're demanding total submission or total annihilation.
And the Assyrians didn't just defeat you, did they? They erased you.
They erased you. They deported entire populations. They would flay leaders alive and put it on their propaganda release. Fear was, it was their primary weapon of war.
So this is where we usually get let's call it the Sunday school version of the story, right? The narrative we've all heard is pretty straightforward. Sennacherib surrounds the city, Hezekiah prays, the prophet Isaiah shows up and gives a speech, and then, boom, a miracle.
Yeah.
The Assyrians drop dead, Jerusalem is saved, and everyone lives happily ever after.
The simple version, yeah. Clean and tidy.
But when you actually open the Bible to 2 Kings chapters 18 and 19 and you read it carefully,
Right.
really scrutinize the text, it feels like you're reading 2 completely different scripts that have just been, spliced together.
It certainly does to the modern eye. And honestly, it's a text that has frustrated historians, theologians, and biblical scholars for, over a century. Because just as you said, there's a massive conflict right on the surface of the narrative. It's not hidden. It's glaring.
It's right there. Let's just walk through the jump cut that happens here. In one breath, we read that Hezekiah surrenders. He literally strips the gold off the temple doors. He pays a massive tribute. He apologizes. He literally says to the Assyrian king, I have done wrong. It's a total capitulation. He is writing the check to make the bad men go away.
Right.
But then, immediately after verse 16, the story just seems to reboot. Suddenly, he's defiant. He's refusing to surrender. And then the Assyrian army is miraculously destroyed by an angel. So which one is it? Did he pay up and bow down, or did he stand tall and watch God fight his battle for him?
And that is the central tension we are unpacking today. For a long, long time, the academic consensus was that you simply couldn't reconcile these accounts. They had to be different sources, maybe even different events that were clumsily pasted together by some later editor who just didn't care about consistency. But today, we're doing a deep dive into the work of a scholar named Paul S. Evans.
Yeah.
And he basically decided to challenge that whole consensus. He argues that we've been reading this all wrong, and that what looks like a contradiction is actually a really sophisticated literary device.
So the mission for this deep dive is to tackle some of these huge questions. Is the biblical text just a messy collage of contradictory stories, a scissors and paste job? Or is this actually a literary masterpiece that we've just been too impatient to understand? And historically speaking, did Sennacherib actually besiege Jerusalem, or have we all been sort of hallucinating a siege that never really happened?
It's a fascinating detective story. We have Assyrian annals, we have biblical texts, we have Egyptian history, and a whole lot of scholarly assumptions that Evans is going to dismantle piece by piece.
I love it when we get to dismantle assumptions. But before we get to Evans's solution, we have to understand the problem. So we need to talk about the state-child's hypothesis. It sounds like a law firm, but I gather it's actually the dominant academic theory for why this text looks the way it does.
It does sound like a law firm, doesn't it?
Oh.
Stade, Childs, and Associates.
Yeah.
But no, you're right. Bernard Stade and Brevard Childs were 2 absolute heavyweights in biblical scholarship.
Okay.
Stade, writing way back in the late 19th century in Germany, he looked at 2 Kings 18 and 19 and essentially said, this doesn't make any sense as one story. You have to remember the context of 19th century German scholarship. This was the era of source criticism.
Right. This is when scholars were obsessed with finding the sources behind the text. They viewed the Bible not as a unified book, but as this kind of patchwork quilt of different documents, JEPD, all stitched together.
Exactly. And their goal was to peel back the theological paint to find the historical wall underneath.
Yeah.
They were rationalists, for the most part. They assumed that ancient editors were clumsy.
Clumsy.
Yeah, they would take two contradictory scrolls and just tape them together without trying to smooth out the edges or harmonize them. So when Stade looked at this text, he saw a seam that he just couldn't ignore.
So walk us through the logic of this seam. Why were they so convinced it had to be two different stories?
Well, just look at the sequence in the text itself. In chapter 18, verses 13 through 16, you have what scholars now call account A. It reads very, very dryly. It's very realistic. Sennacherib attacks the fortified cities of Judah. He captures them. Hezekiah gets scared.
Yeah.
And he sends a message to the Assyrian camp at Lachish saying, I've done wrong. Withdraw from me. Whatever you impose on me, I will bear.
Okay, stop right there. I have done wrong. That is the language of a vassal king who rebelled against his suzerain and has just realized he lost. That's a political confession.
Precisely. And Sennacherib treats it as such. He imposes a penalty. He demands 300 talents of silver and 30 talents of gold. Hezekiah pays it. He empties the treasuries. He strips the temple doors. End of transaction. The text in account A implies that Hezekiah bought his safety.
Okay, that sounds like history. Sad history, but history. He paid the protection money.
Right. It feels archival. In fact, many scholars believe account A was probably taken directly from the royal chronicles or temple archives in Jerusalem. But then, immediately after verse 16, the story seems to restart.
Yes.
Suddenly, three high-ranking Assyrian officials, the Tartan, the Rabsaris, and the Rabshakeh, they show up at Jerusalem with what the text calls a heavy force, and they start demanding surrender.
Wait, but he just paid. This is the plot hole that drove the 19th century guys crazy, right?
This is it.
If account A is true, the war is over. Sennacherib got his money, the check cleared. Why is he sending his generals to yell at the people on the wall?
Exactly. And that is the absolute crux of the Stade Child's hypothesis.
Yeah.
They argue that a single author wouldn't write a story where the king pays tribute, resolves the conflict, and then gets threatened anyway as if the payment never happened. It just violates the logic of a linear narrative.
So they concluded it must be two different sources.
Two different sources describing the same event, but from very, very different perspectives. And the editor of Kings just, mashed them together.
So they got out the rhetorical scissors. Account A goes in one pile and the rest goes in another.
They did. They labeled the first part, account A, the realistic political account.
Yeah.
And they labeled the rest of it, account B, the legendary theological account. But then they looked at account B and said, wait a minute, this is messy too.
Cut it up even further.
Oh yeah. They noticed that within this so-called legendary account, there seemed to be two different versions of how the Assyrians leave.
Oh.
In one version, which they call B1, the Assyrian commander hears a rumor that the king of Egypt, Tirhakah, is coming up to fight him. So he packs up and leaves.
Okay, so that's the rumor ending?
Right. But then you have B2, which is the miraculous ending. And in this version, Isaiah gives a completely different prophecy, and that very night, the angel of Yahweh goes out and kills 185,000 Assyrian troops.
So the logic is a single author wouldn't write a story where the king pays a tribute, then gets threatened anyway, then the enemy leaves because of a rumor, and also leaves because everyone in the army died. It's just too chaotic. It's overkill.
It's narrative overkill, exactly. They also argued the theology changes. Account A is secular. Hezekiah is just a politician trying to survive. Account B is what they'd call Zion-centric, this idea that God will never let Jerusalem fall. They view the repetition like the Assyrian messengers coming twice, as a doublet, which for them was basically proof that two versions in the same story were just stacked on top of each other.
And this has been the dominant view for, what, 100 years?
Oh, easily. It's the standard textbook explanation. If you go to seminary or take a university course on the Hebrew Bible, this is very likely what you learn. It's the scissors and paste method of biblical criticism. It just assumes the Bible is a collection of scraps rather than a cohesive book.
But Paul S. Evans comes along and says, everybody put down the scissors.
He does. Evans argues that this hypothesis has been accepted for far too long without enough real scrutiny. He approaches the text using what's called rhetorical criticism.
Okay, what's that?
So instead of asking where did these pieces come from, he asks how does this function as a unified story? He wants to treat the final text as a piece of literature that was put together with intent, not by accident.
So what's his first strike against the scissors people?
Well, the first big one is stylistic unity. Evans argues that if you actually look at the Hebrew, the writing style doesn't change between these so-called sources.
Really?
Yeah. It all looks like what scholars call Deuteronomistic writing, which is the specific style, vocabulary, and theological outlook of the editors of the Book of Kings. If these were totally different documents from different centuries, one a dry chronicle, one a folk legend, you would expect the language to shift.
Right.
You'd expect a change in tone or vocabulary or grammar,
Hmm.
but Evans says it doesn't. It's seamless.
That's a good point. I mean, if I paste a page of a legal contract into a page of a fantasy novel, you're going to tell the difference instantly. But here, the voice is consistent. So what about the contradiction in Hezekiah's character? The politician versus the saint. That seems like a harder hurdle to get over.
Evans calls this a false contradiction. He really challenges the assumption that a person has to be one thing or the other. He asks, why can't a character be complex? Why can't Hezekiah be a man under immense pressure who tries a political solution, first paying the tribute, and then when that fails, turns to prayer?
That's actually much more realistic. I mean, if I'm in trouble, I usually try to fix it myself first. I check my bank account, I call a friend. It's only when I'm completely out of options that I usually stop and, pray.
Exactly. That's human nature. Evans argues that the text is showing us a character arc. Hezekiah starts in fear, trying to buy his way out using the wisdom of the world. When that fails, he's forced into a corner where he has no choice but to rely on Yahweh. That's not a contradiction between sources. That's the development of a character.
I like that. It makes him more relatable. But what about the doublet? You mentioned the messengers come twice. Isn't that redundant? Why have the Rapshakeh come, give a big speech, leave, and then send messengers again?
Evans argues it's not redundancy, it's literary intensification.
Yeah.
This is a standard storytelling technique. You don't just repeat the threat, you raise the stakes.
Okay.
Look at the difference between the two visits. The first time the Rabshakeh, who is the Assyrian mouthpiece, comes, he warns the people on the wall that Hezekiah is deceiving them. He says, don't let Hezekiah deceive you. It's a political attack.
Okay. Standard propaganda. Your leader is lying to you. We see that all the time.
But the second time, the message escalates dramatically. The letter that's sent to Hezekiah says, do not let your God in who you trust deceive you.
Oh, wow. So it goes from the king is a liar to God is a liar.
Yeah. Exactly. The stakes have been raised from the political realm to the theological realm. It's not the same story told twice. It's one story spiraling toward a theological climax. If you cut it apart because you think it's just repetitive, you lose that entire escalation. You miss the point that the Assyrians are crossing a fundamental line from attacking a nation to attacking that nation's deity.
Okay, I'm starting to see the masterpiece argument taking shape. The text is building tension. But we still have to deal with the biggest plot hole of all, the elephant in the room, or maybe the talent of gold in the room. Why did Sennacherib attack after Hezekiah paid the tribute? If account A isn't a separate source, how do we explain the timeline? Hezekiah pays, Sennacherib takes the money, and then attacks anyway. Is Sennacherib just a jerk, or is there something we're missing?
Well, he probably was a jerk. He was an Assyrian emperor, after all. That was sort of in the job description.
Yeah.
But Evan thinks there's a very specific reason in the text, and this is one of those aha moments that comes from reading the Hebrew very, very closely. We have to go back and look at 2 Kings 18, verses 14 to 16 again.
Okay, let's unpack this. This is the part people usually skim over.
Right. Sennacherib demands 300 talents of silver and 30 talents of gold. That is the price for peace.
Got it. A ransom.
Verse 15 says, Hezekiah gave all the silver that was found in the house of the Lord and in the treasuries of the king's house. The Hebrew verb there is natan, he gave. It implies a completed transaction. He handed it over.
Okay. He emptied the bank accounts. Transaction complete on the silver.
But then look at verse 16. It says, Hezekiah stripped the gold from the doors of the temple of the Lord. The verb is quitzats. He cut off.
Right. Desperate times, he's defacing the temple to pay the bill.
But, and this is the crucial detail Evans points out, the text never explicitly says he successfully sent the gold in the same way it confirms the silver was sent.
Wait, I've always just assumed he paid it all.
It says he gave the silver. It says he stripped the gold and then gave it to the king of Assyria. But the syntax is a little different. It's even a bit clumsy. It suggests the action of stripping the gold was the focus, but the delivery is left ambiguous. Evans suggests a theory. Hezekiah reneged on the gold.
He stiffed the Assyrian emperor. That seems, suicidal.
Extremely unwise, yes. But think about the logistics. Gathering 300 talents of silver from a treasury is relatively easy. It's coins or ingots. You pack it up and ship it. But stripping gold, plating off massive temple doors, that takes time. That takes a lot of labor, and psychologically, that is a deep religious violation.
So the idea is maybe he sent the silver, hoping it would be enough to placate him.
Exactly. Evans suggests maybe he couldn't gather the gold in time, or he held it back hoping the silver, which included emptying his personal palace treasury, would satisfy Sennacherib. Perhaps he sent extra silver to make up for the shortfall. But the text leaves this crucial ambiguity. He stripped the doors, but did the gold actually leave Jerusalem? Did it ever arrive at the Assyrian camp at Lachish?
That changes everything. Because if he failed to pay the full price, specifically the gold, then Sennacherib isn't just breaking a treaty for fun, he's reacting to a breach of contract.
Precisely. It explains the continued Assyrian aggression. They aren't breaking the treaty. From their perspective, Hezekiah did. He shorted the payout. And narratively, think about what this does to Hezekiah's character. He gives away the silver, the secular treasury, the palace money. That's the easy part, relatively speaking.
Yeah.
But he hesitates on the gold. And where was the gold? On the temple doors, the holy things.
So he's trying to save the holiness of the temple while sacrificing all the secular stuff. He's conflicted. He's trying to negotiate with a tiger.
He's trying to have it both ways. He's trying to buy off the devil without giving up the things of God. And it fails. Because you can't shortchange an empire like Assyria. This failure to pay the full price is what triggers the rest of the narrative. The crisis isn't resolved by the tribute. It's exacerbated by it. The Assyrians come back and say, "You think you can play games with the great king? Now we want everything."
This is brilliant. It completely removes the need to chop the text in half. The contradiction isn't a mistake by some clumsy editor. It's the cause and effect engine of the entire story. The failed payment leads directly to the second threat.
Precisely. And once you see that, the rest of the narrative flows as a single coherent event. But Evans doesn't stop there. He takes on another massive assumption that we all have, one that is drilled into our heads from every documentary we've ever watched about this.
Which is?
The siege of Jerusalem.
Whoa, hold on. The siege of Jerusalem is the whole point of the story, isn't it? The Assyrian annals famously say Sennacherib shut Hezekiah up like a bird in a cage. We have mental images of battering rams, siege towers, people starving inside the walls and eating leather. Are you saying that didn't happen?
I'm saying Evans argues we need to reread the military movement very, very carefully. And when you do, the siege starts to look very different. In fact, Evans argues there was never a siege in the technical sense of the word.
Okay, you need to break this down for me because bird in a cage sounds a lot like a siege to me.
First, let's look at the Assyrian annals themselves. We have Sennacherib's own account of this campaign written on what's called the Taylor Prism. He is very proud of his accomplishments. When he attacks the city of Lachish, for example, he describes it in vivid, gruesome detail. "I conquered it using ramps, battering rams, infantry attacks, mines, breaches, and sappers." He loves listing his military tech.
He's showing off the hardware. Look at all my cool toys.
Absolutely. But when he gets to Jerusalem, the language changes. He says, "I shut him up like a bird in a cage." He mentions building earthworks around the city to stop people from going out the city gate. But he never once mentions battering rams. He never mentions assault ramps against the walls of Jerusalem itself.
That is a very suspicious silence. If he had stormed the walls or even set up the ramps to do so, you'd think he would have bragged about it.
Exactly. Silence in Assyrian propaganda is often an admission that the thing you expect to hear about didn't happen. Now let's turn to the Bible. In 2 Kings 18:17, the text says the Rabshakeh arrived with a heavy force. In Hebrew, that phrase is Hail Kabed. Traditionalists have always assumed Hail Kabed means a massive invasion army.
Sounds like it. Heavy force. It sounds like the main battalion are showing up.
But Evans points us to a fascinating parallel in 2 Kings chapter 6, the story of the prophet Elisha. Remember when the king of Aram wants to capture Elisha? The text says he sent a Hail Kabed to capture him.
To capture one guy.
Exactly. You don't send the entire D-Day invasion force to capture one prophet in a house. You send a SWAT team, a large escort, a heavy security detail. Evans argues that the Hail Kabed of Jerusalem wasn't the main Assyrian army. The main army, the one with the battering rams and the thousands of archers, was busy fighting at Lachish and then Libnah. The force at Jerusalem was a high-level diplomatic delegation, the Tartan, the Rabsaris, the Rabshakeh, with a very heavy security detail.
So they weren't there to storm the walls.
No, they were there to intimidate Hezekiah into opening the gates himself. It was a show of force, not an application of force.
So it's a blockade, not an assault. It's a standoff.
It's a psychological operation. And this is absolutely crucial because of the prophecy that Isaiah gives later in the story. In 2 Kings 19.32, Isaiah predicts this concerning the king of Assyria. "He shall not come into this city, shoot an arrow there, come before it with a shield, or cast up a siege ramp against it."
Oh, I see where you're going. If there had been a full-blown siege with ramps and shields and arrows flying, Isaiah's prophecy would have been false.
Exactly. Critics for years have said, well, Isaiah was obviously wrong about the details because we know there was a siege. Evans completely flips that. He says, no, the narrative is perfectly consistent. Isaiah said there wouldn't be a siege ramp, and the narrative never describes a siege ramp. It describes a blockade and a diplomatic standoff. The Assyrians threatened, they blocked the exits, but they never launched the formal siege engine assault on Jerusalem.
That makes the Rabshakeh's role even more important then. If they aren't attacking with rams, they have to attack with words. They're trying to talk the city into suicide.
That is exactly right. This is information warfare, and that brings us to those incredible speeches. The Rabshakeh isn't just some thug. He's a master of propaganda. He is the ancient equivalent of a psyops specialist.
Let's talk about this speech. It's famous. He stands by the aqueduct, the city's water source, which is a power move in itself, and just lets them have it. What is he actually doing there, rhetorically?
Well, his primary goal is to drive a wedge between the king and the people. Notice a key detail. He never uses Hezekiah's royal title. He just calls him Hezekiah. But he calls Sennacherib the great king. It's a rhetorical power play from the very first sentence. He's delegitimizing Hezekiah right in front of his own subjects.
Then he speaks in Hebrew, right, the Judean language?
Yes, deliberately. The Judean officials, Eliakim, Shebna, and Joah, they completely panic. They beg him, please speak Aramaic. We understand it. Don't speak Hebrew so the people on the wall can hear. They want to keep this a diplomatic negotiation between elites. But the Rabshakeh refuses. He shouts even louder in Hebrew. He wants the common soldier to hear. He wants them to be terrified. He says, has my master sent me to speak these words to your master and to you, and not to the men sitting on the wall, who are doomed with you to eat their own dung and drink their own urine?
That is just so graphic and terrifying. He's telling them, your king's policies are going to lead to you starving to death in the most horrible way.
And Evans talks about a theme of hearing in the text. The Hebrew root is Shema, just pulses through the whole story.
Like the prayer, Hear, O Israel.
Exactly. Think back to why the northern kingdom, Samaria, fell just a few chapters earlier in 2 Kings. The text says explicitly it was because they did not hear or listen to the voice of Yahweh their God.
Okay, so lack of hearing equals death and exile.
Now, the Rabshakeh stands at the wall and demands that they hear the great king of Assyria. He shouts, hear the word of the great king. Then what does Hezekiah do? He goes to the temple and asks Yahweh to hear the blasphemy. Incline your ear, O Lord, and hear. It's a contest of listening. Who will the people listen to? The tangible threat shouting over the wall or the invisible God in the temple?
And ultimately, the resolution comes through hearing, doesn't it? Sennacherib hears a rumor and retreats.
Exactly. The battle is fought over who listens to whom. And linked directly to this theme of hearing is the theme of trust. The Hebrew word is bata. The Rabshakeh mocks the concept of trust over and over again. He asks, what is this confidence in which you trust? He says, you trust in Egypt. That's a broken reed. It will pierce your hand if you lean on it.
Which, to be fair, was usually true about Egypt. They were notoriously unreliable allies in this period.
It was excellent geopolitical analysis. He wasn't wrong. But then he pivots from the political to the theological. He says, but if you say, we trust in Yahweh our God, has any god of any nation saved their land from the king of Assyria? Where are the gods of Hamath and Arpad? Where are the gods of Sepharvaim? He is challenging the core theology of Israel. Is Yahweh unique, or is he just another local deity who is about to get steamrolled by the Assyrian war machine?
That is the ultimate question of the Old Testament, isn't it? Is God real and sovereign, or is he just a cultural projection, just another tribal god?
It is, and the entire narrative is structured to force that question. It's not just a war story, it's a theological duel. The Rabshakeh makes a very logical argument. Look at the data points. I have destroyed everyone else. Your God is next on the list.
Yeah.
And Hezekiah has to bet everything he has on the idea that Yahweh is not just another data point on that list.
So we have the tribute failure, the blockade instead of a siege, the propaganda war. Now let's get to the messy historical stuff. The mice, the Egyptians, the angel. Because eventually the Assyrians do leave, and they leave in a hurry. How does Evans put this historical puzzle together?
This is where we get into some really fascinating historical reconstruction. Evans argues we need to take the rumor of the Egyptian army very seriously. The text mentions Tirhakah, king of Cush. Now, historically, Tirhakah was a Nubian pharaoh of Egypt's 25th dynasty.
But critics have pointed out a problem with the dates, right? They say he was too young in 701 BCE to actually be king.
That's true. He likely wasn't the pharaoh yet in 701. He was probably a prince or maybe a general leading the army. He became pharaoh later. But the Bible calls him king of Cush by anticipation. It's like talking about President Eisenhower during World War II. He wasn't president yet, but we use the title because that's how we know him. Evans argues that whether he was king or prince, the presence of an Egyptian-Ethiopian expeditionary force on the move is historically plausible.
So the rumor in the text was actually the news of this army advancing north.
Yes, and strategically, this is huge. Imagine Sennacherib's position. He has his main army besieging the city of Libnah. He has a smaller task force blockading Jerusalem. Suddenly, he gets intelligence that a fresh Egyptian army is marching up from the south. He's in danger of being flanked. He cannot afford to get bogged down in a long standoff at Jerusalem if the Egyptians are coming to hit his main force.
So the Egyptian army wasn't necessarily a savior that came and defeated Assyria in a big battle, but they were a distraction. They forced Sennacherib to split his attention and change his plans.
Exactly. But the distraction alone doesn't explain the catastrophe, because the Bible says the angel of Yahweh struck down 185,000 men. That's a lot of bodies.
Right. And this brings us to one of the coolest connections in ancient history. You mentioned Herodotus earlier, the Greek historian.
Yes, the father of history. He wrote about 250 years after these events. He traveled to Egypt, and he interviewed Egyptian priests about their history. And he records a tradition about Sennacherib's invasion.
Does he mention an angel?
No. He mentions field mice.
Mice! Like squeak, squeak.
Yes. He tells a story that while the Assyrian army was facing the Egyptians at a place called Pelusium, a swarm of field mice descended on their camp in the night. And the mice ate their bowstrings, their quivers, and the leather handles of their shields.
So they woke up completely unarmed.
Unarmed and panicked. They fled and suffered heavy losses because they couldn't fight back. Now, on the surface, that sounds like a fairy tale. Mice eating bowstrings. But in the ancient world, mice were a very specific symbol.
Tell us about the symbolism.
Mice were symbols of plague. You can think of the Greek god Apollo Smintheus, the mouse Apollo. In the Iliad, he's the god who shoots arrows of plague into the Greek camp. If an ancient person heard a story about mice destroying an army, they would immediately decode that as disease.
Oh, that's interesting. So Herodotus is recording the symptom, the story about mice, which implies the cause. A massive outbreak of disease in the camp.
Exactly. Evans synthesizes all of this. He suggests there is a historical kernel here. A disaster struck the Assyrian army, most likely a plague or a serious camp illness dysentery, cholera perhaps, exacerbated by the unsanitary conditions of a long campaign and a lack of fresh water. This disaster, combined with the strategic pressure from the advancing Egyptian army, caused a sudden, catastrophic withdrawal.
And the biblical text interprets this historical disaster, this plague, theologically, as the angel of Yahweh.
Precisely. In the Bible, the angel of Yahweh, or the destroyer, is often the agent of plague. You can think of the Passover or the plague that struck Israel in David's time. It fits the pattern perfectly. And notice the location. Evans points out something crucial. The text does not actually say the 185,000 died right outside the walls of Jerusalem.
It doesn't. I've always pictured them just piled up outside the Zion gate, like Hezekiah looks over the wall in the morning and sees a field of bodies.
It just says the angel struck in the camp of the Assyrians. If the main army, the main invasion force, was at Libnah or Eltekeh, getting ready to fight the Egyptians, that's where the main camp was. That's where the plague would have hit the hardest.
That makes so much more sense. So the detachment at Jerusalem, the blockade force, would have just received an urgent message. The main army is down, the king is retreating, fall back immediately.
Exactly. Jerusalem is spared not because 185,000 bodies dropped right outside the window, but because the main Assyrian engine broke down a few miles away, and they had to retreat all the way back to Nineveh.
It fits the historical data, it fits the Herodotus account, and it fits the biblical narrative if you just read it carefully. It creates a single, coherent picture of what happened in 701 BCE.
And it does so without having to chop the Bible into pieces. It respects the text as a unified story.
Now, we do have to address one loose end, the two-campaign theory. I've heard some people say, well, maybe Sennacherib just came back later.
Yeah, this is a theory some scholars have used to try and fix the contradictions of the old state child's hypothesis. They say, okay, maybe 701 BCE was the tribute year. Hezekiah paid, Sennacherib left. Then maybe 15 or 20 years later, he came back a second time, and that's when the angel killed all the troops.
Evans isn't buying it.
Not at all. Evans argues there is zero archaeological or Assyrian evidence for a second campaign into Judah. Sennacherib's records are very complete. We know where he went almost every single year of his reign. He never came back to Jerusalem.
So the two-campaign theory is basically a phantom campaign. It's an invention.
It is. It's a desperate attempt to save the old theory. It's saying the biblical text is right, but the dates are all wrong. Evans says, nope, the text is a literary unit describing one single complex event that took place in 701. You don't need to invent a second war to make sense of the story.
Finally, we have to talk about the death of Sennacherib, because the Bible makes it sound like he just goes home and gets murdered immediately.
It does. Verse 36 says he departed and went home to Nineveh. Verse 37 says his sons Adramelech and Sharezer struck him down with a sword while he was worshiping in the temple of his god Nisroch.
But historically, didn't he live for quite a while after this?
He lived for another 20 years. He wasn't murdered until 681 BCE.
So is the Bible just wrong on the timing, or is this another literary technique at play?
Evans calls this telescoping. It's a common literary device in ancient historiography. The author collapses the timeline to show the theological cause and effect. The point isn't this happened on Tuesday and that happened on Wednesday. The point is, Sennacherib defied Yahweh. He claimed his gods were stronger, and in the end he was murdered in the temple of his own god.
That is some heavy irony.
It's the ultimate irony. The Rabshakeh mocked Hezekiah for trusting in a god who couldn't save him. But in the end, Sennacherib's god, Nisroch, couldn't save him from his own sons in his own temple. The prophecy Isaiah gave that Sennacherib would fall by the sword is fulfilled. The author connects the defiance in 701 directly to the death in 681 to show that divine justice, though sometimes delayed, was inevitable.
It's almost cinematic. It's like a movie montage where you fade from the crime straight to the punishment, skipping the 20 years of waiting in between.
Exactly. And that just reinforces Evans' main point. This is a literary masterpiece. It's constructed with intent. It's not a scissors and paste job by a clumsy editor. The author knows exactly what he's doing.
So let's try and wrap this up. We've gone from what looked like a clumsy collection of contradictions to a really sophisticated, unified narrative. What are the big takeaways for you from Evans's work?
Well, first, it's the literary unity. Evans shows us that structure really matters. The seeming repetitions and contradictions are actually intensifications. The story pulses between threat and assurance, creating this rhythm that's all about trust.
Second, the tribute. That one detail about the gold explains the whole conflict. It turns what scholars saw as a plot hole into the main plot point. Hezekiah tried to be half-committed, keeping the holy gold while giving up the secular silver, and it nearly cost him everything.
And third, the nature of the so-called siege. By understanding it as a blockade and a propaganda war, we see that the real battle wasn't military. It was psychological and theological. It was a battle for the mind and soul of the people.
And finally, the history itself. It's not pure myth. There's a historical core there. The Egyptians, the probable plague, the stone withdrawal, that has been woven into a powerful theological testimony.
Right. The author isn't just recording facts. He's interpreting the meaning of those facts for his audience. He's telling them why Jerusalem survived when every other city in the region burned. He is saying, it wasn't our army, it wasn't our gold, it was our God.
It really does change how you read 2 Kings. It stops being a dusty chronicle and starts feeling like a very human story about fear, compromise, and ultimately about trust.
And that is the power of good biblical scholarship. It doesn't destroy the text, it dusts it off so you can see the brilliance that was there all along. It takes the Sunday school story and gives it the weight of real history and real human drama.
I want to leave our listener with a final thought. We've talked a lot about trust today. That Hebrew word batah, the Rabshakeh asked Hezekiah, on whom do you trust? And for a moment, the answer was, my bank account. Then it was the Egyptians. And finally, when the bank was empty and the Egyptians were delayed, he had to trust in something he couldn't see.
It's a provocative thought. We usually think of trusting God as the first option, the noble choice. But in this story, it almost feels like the last option. It's what you do when the gold is gone and the walls are surrounded and every other plan has failed.
And perhaps that's the point. Maybe the contradiction that scholars saw between the tribute and the miracle is actually the story of every human life. We try to pay our way out, we try to fix it ourselves, and only when that fails do we finally look up.
That is a profound way to read it. If we stop trying to fix the Bible's seeming contradictions by chopping it up, we might find that the contradictions are actually mirrors. They reflect our own struggle to trust. When the world's superpower is at your door, and all logic of the world says you're a bird in a cage, who do you really trust?
Something to mull over. Thanks for taking this deep dive with us.
A pleasure, as always.
We'll catch you on the next one.